Welcome back to Train Signal. You are watching the video for Lab 2, installing remote installation services and deploying clients. In a typical network, you will have several servers, let's say between 5 to 50 servers, again depending on the size of the network. But you will definitely have a lot of client computers. In fact, in a large network, you may have several hundred clients. One of the biggest challenges that faces us network administrators is how to actually install the operating systems and the applications on these client computers. So in this video, you will learn how to deploy these different operating system and client applications. We will first go over the different deployment options and you will determine which is the best option for you. One of the options is by Microsoft known as Remote Installation Services, also known as RIS. So you will learn the different prerequisite services for RIS. We will actually go ahead and meet all those prerequisite requirements, and then later in this video I will show you how to install and configure RIS. And finally, we will have a live demonstration of deploying the client operating system Windows 2000 Professional using RIS. What are the different client deployment options? So going on to the next screen over here, you will see that there are 5 different ways of installing the client and the applications on these computers. So let's go through each of these processes one by one. The first one is perhaps the most impractical one, which is to install the operating system and applications using CDs. In other words, go to the first computer or the first client machine, install the operating system, install all the applications. Go on to the second one, install the operating system, install the applications, and so forth. Okay, so as you can see, this is a pretty cumbersome method. You will require several CDs and you'll have to go from computer to install the operating system first and the application. Easily to install the application, it takes about 30 to 45 minutes, and then depending on how many applications you have, that will take a few hours as well. So on each computer you may have to spend or dedicate maybe 2 to 3 hours before you're done with the first computer, and now repeat the process for the second computer and so forth. In a small network with maybe about 2 or 3 clients, this may be a practical method, but in a larger network or even for a medium-sized network, this is completely impractical. So going on to the next method over here, which is to install the operating system. In other words, take the CD and then install the operating system. However, the applications on these clients are installed from shares from the network server. In other words, go to the first computer, take the CD, install Microsoft Windows 2000 Professional or XP, and then get the applications from a share on the server. So what you can do is go to one of the servers and share all your application CDs, such as Microsoft Office. So install, or rather copy the entire CD to the server, share it, and then from each of these client computers connect to the share. And as the application is being installed on the first computer, you can go to the next computer, make this connection, and then get the application installed on that as well. Once again, a slight improvement over the first method, but again this is impractical simply for the reason that you have to go to each client computer and to first install the operating system, which takes a long time in any case. And then the only benefit you're deriving out here is that you're installing applications on several of these computers simultaneously through a central network server. But again, impractical nonetheless. So the third option then is to install the operating system manually and let the group policy objects, also known as GPOs, deploy applications. I've covered this topic extensively in Lab 14 of the Advanced Active Directory series, whereby you assume that you already have the operating system on the computer. As the user logs on to the network, they will get the appropriate applications that is assigned to them. So this is a vast improvement over the other two methods. The only problem over here is I'm still installing the operating system manually by means of a CD. So the biggest task in this particular video is to automate the installation of the operating system itself. In other words, you have done a good job setting up a few servers. Now you must have an automatic method, or at least a much more flexible and better method of getting the operating system installed on each of the client machines. And there are 2 different ways of doing this. The first method is a Microsoft method known as the Remote Installation Services, which we will use in this video. This remote installation services can be used to deploy only the client, namely Microsoft Windows 2000 Professional, and or applications as well. So you have a choice. You can choose to do only the operating system, or you can do the operating system and the applications combined. In this particular video, actually in the first part of this video, I will actually do RIS just for the operating system, and then later on I'll show you how to combine the operating system along with the applications for RIS. So that's going to be the discussion of this particular video. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how to use a third-party imaging software such as Symantec Ghost to create client images and then deploy those images on client machines, thereby getting both the operating system and the applications at the same time. So let us now study in detail the method known as Remote Installation Services, or RIS. Let me go on to the next screen. And in this screen, first I'm going to explain to you the prerequisites of actually configuring a server with RIS. There are several important prerequisites, and before going through the diagram over here, let me just take you to these requirements. There are two different categories of requirements: requirements on the server side of the network and then requirements on the client side. Let's first cover the server side requirements. On the server side, what I need is a server that has Windows 2000 or Windows 2003 installed. And on that server, you're going to install remote installation services. So in our case, we're going to use Windows 2000 server on which I'm going to install RIS. You also need the presence of a domain controller, namely Active Directory. In our case, we have already set up DC1 as a domain controller for the benandbrady.com. So we actually have Active Directory available in our network. And I've covered this topic in a previous video, and I've shown you that that Active Directory actually exists on benandbrady.com. The next requirement then is to set up a DNS server, which again was done as part of the DC promo process of installing Active Directory. So at this point, we have Windows 2000 server on which RIS is not yet installed. I will install that soon. We have Active Directory. We have DNS server. What we also need is the DHCP server to assign IP addresses to client installed. So I'm going to do that as part of the prerequisites over here. So as far as the server side prerequisites is concerned, I already have Windows 2000 server, I have Active Directory, I have DNS. What we need to do is install a DHCP server and configure it so that it can give out IP addresses to clients. And what I will also do is install and configure RIS on the Windows 2000 server. So that's the server side requirements. Now there are some requirements on the client side also. Here's the requirement. Actually, there's just one requirement. The client must have a pre-boot execution environment. So let me explain to you what this pre-boot execution is. You may have noticed that when a client boots up, it tries to find the operating system on a removable drive such as a floppy drive or a CD-ROM, and then if it fails, and again depending on the order in which it is set up, it may find it either on the floppy or on the CD-ROM, and then it will finally look on the hard disk, and once it finds the operating system on the hard disk, it starts booting up from there. In a pre-boot execution environment, what the client does is, besides looking for the operating system on the floppy disk and or on the CD-ROM and on the hard disk, what it also does is, if it cannot find the operating system on either of these three, namely the floppy disk, the CD-ROM or the hard disk, it will actually use its network card to connect to a server and see if a server can actually give it an operating system to it before it starts booting up. So that's what pre-boot execution means, that when it finds that it does not have an operating system on either the local drives or on a removable drive on that computer, it will try to contact the central server and get the operating system from there. So your client must meet that requirement, and a lot of computers are equipped with a PXE chip on it that will instruct it to actually use the installed NIC card and then install and connect to a server to get a client operating system. If you do not have a PXE client, in other words, your motherboard does not support this feature called PXE, then what you can do is you can use one of the NIC cards that is supported, and I'll go through the NIC cards that are supported. And on that supported NIC card, what you do is you create a client boot floppy disk using the RIS server. So what you have to do is the following. You have to create a floppy disk that will simulate the PXE environment like as if the PXE chip is installed on your computer. So either you have the PXE environment, or if you do not have the PXE environment, make sure that you're using one of the supported network interface cards, and then create a client boot floppy. And I'll show you the procedure for creating this boot floppy on the RIS server. What this boot floppy does is that it will boot the computer from the floppy disk and then simulate the PXE environment so that the client can actually connect to a server and then obtain the operating system. So once again, these are rigid requirements and they must be met. On the server side, you must have Windows 2000 server or Windows 2003 server with RIS installed and configured. You must have Active Directory, namely you need a domain controller in your network. You must have a DNS server, and finally you require a DHCP server so that when this client boots up, it either uses the PXE chip or the floppy disk to obtain an IP address from the DHCP server so that it can connect to the RIS server and then obtain the image of the operating system. So those were the requirements, and in our case, like I mentioned, we have to install RIS and then we have to install and configure the DHCP server. So we're going to do that soon. Now, before we do that, let me show you exactly how this RIS is going to work. So let me take you to this diagram over here. And there are several services that are used in conjunction with RISC. In this figure, there is a server for remote installation services. So here's the RISC server, and this RISC server is going to use the following services that I'm going to explain. Here's our Active Directory, or the presence of a domain controller. Here's a DHCP server, here's a DNS server, and then finally we have a PXE client that should meet the following requirements. So let's first talk about exactly how this process is going to take place. This is what happens. When the client boots up, it will try to see if it has an operating system on the hard disk. And in our case, we have not installed the operating system on the client computer. So it will first try to get the operating system from the floppy disk. If it doesn't find it there, it will see if there is a CD-ROM that is inserted from which it can install the operating system. And in the absence of that, it will use the PXE environment either from the floppy disk or from the PXE boot ROM that is in the computer itself, and then try to contact the RISC server so that it can obtain the image from it. Now, before it can make the connection to the RISC server, it needs an IP address that is proper for that particular network. So what it does is it sends out a request to the DHCP server, namely the DHCP discover packet, and then the DHCP server then assigns it an IP address. Once it finds the IP address, then it connects to the RISC server and then tries to obtain the operating system from there. And again, you will see all this in action with appropriate folders, so you know exactly how this works. Once you connect to RISC server, you have to authenticate yourself, meaning that you need to have permission to actually use this RISC server and get the operating system from it. That's where the Active Directory and the DNS server comes in. So once you're authenticated, it will then transfer the files from the remote installation server to the PXE client. Once all the files are transferred from the remote installation server to the PXE client over here, the PXE client will then reboot, and then the operating system is finally installed on that computer. One of the biggest advantages of this method is that you can have several of these PXE clients log in or connect to this RISC server one by one, okay, or simultaneously, and then all of them will get the operating systems at the same time. Now, in order to accomplish all this, the RISC server uses what is known as a binary boot service. This is a boot service that will actually let the PXE client connect to it and then respond to the PXE client by giving it the operating system. Now, in order for the RISC server to give the operating system to the PXE client, it has to transfer all the files of the operating system from here to the PXE client. To do that, it uses what is known as a trivial file transfer protocol service. You must have heard of FTP. This is trivial FTP. Namely, it is a connectionless service where the files will quickly be transferred from the RISC server to the client. This D over here stands for the daemon. In other words, this is running a TFTP service daemon that will make sure that the files are transferred from the RISC server to the PXE client. Now, to make this process efficient, there is also a service known as single instance store service. What this does is that if you have several images that you have on the RISC server, it will not duplicate the files that is needed for each of those images by making sure that if the file already exists on the hard disk, it will not reinstall that file again. And I'm going to talk about this further in detail as we're doing the lab. So for now, what you need to understand is the following. Your computer will boot up, it will obtain the IP address from the DHCP server, it will then contact the RISC server, whereby the RISC server will ask the PXE client to actually log in. That's where the DNS server and the Active Directory comes in. Once you have successfully logged in, then it will use the file transfer service, namely the TFTP service, to transfer the files from the RISC server to the client. Once the client has all the operating system files installed on it, it will shut down, restart. Once the computer restarts, you will have the operating system installed on this computer. And you can have several of these PXE clients connect to the RISC server simultaneously so that all of them get the operating systems at the same time. So we're going to go about doing this process on the screen. So to begin with, let's first check whether we have met our prerequisites. So I'm going to minimize this screen and then make a connection to DC1. So let's start a lab. And I'm going to log in to benandbrady.com network. Alrighty, and let's verify a few things. Do we have Active Directory? Well, yes, we do. And again, we have seen it before, but I'm just showing you these steps over here just to make sure that if you're starting this computer, if you're starting the labs using this particular video as a first video, you better have an Active Directory installed. So in our case, it is done. So we are all set with that. We also know that we have a DNS server. So let's verify that the existence of a DNS server. So here we go. Let's go to the admin tools DNS, and our DNS server is up and running. We have two computers and they're both registered over here as DC1 and DC2 to a DNS server. So let's close this box also. So far we have server 2000, we have DNS, we have Active Directory. Now what we need to do is install and configure RIS, and we have to install a service known as DHCP. Let's first begin by installing the service known as DHCP. To install a service, you have to go to Start, Settings, go to the Control Panel, and in the Control Panel select Add Remove Programs, and then over there let's add and remove window components. This is the method to install additional services in Windows 2000. And then over here, you need to pick a service known as DHCP. To do that, you need to go to the networking services link over here. Please do not select, always highlight it and then go to details. If you attempt to select it, what happens is it unchecks this box and Windows 2000 thinks that you're trying to uninstall the service. So make sure you select it, click on details, and then over here, we need to select the DHCP protocol. Click on OK, click on the next button. And then since I'm running terminal services on this computer, I'm going to make sure that it installs in the remote administration mode so that I can show you all the activities on the screen of DC1 from my remote desktop over here. If you have not installed terminal services, you will not see the screen. So don't worry about it. If you've installed terminal services, you will see the screen. If you have not, you're not supposed to see the screen. So click on the next button, and now it's going to install the DHCP service. My server 2000 CD was already in the computer, so it's going to get the files that it requires and then finally install DHCP. Once DHCP service is installed, we will configure it so that it can give the IP address, the subnet mask, and of course the DNS server to the client. So I'm going to show you how to configure that as well. So let's wait until this DHCP service is finished configuring, and then we'll go about doing that. So going back to the diagram over here, actually it just finished, but what we are doing is we are setting up the DHCP server, and I'm going to say this several times in these video series. There are actually two steps of doing anything in networking. The first step is to actually install, and the second step is to configure. So to install, what you do is you go to Add Remove Programs, Windows Components, and then do it from there, like we just finished. And then to configure it, what you need to do is go to, let's close these windows, go to Start, Programs, Admin Tools, and then pick up the DHCP program that has just been installed over here. And we will configure DHCP to provide IP addresses to our network. So let me show you how to do that. I'm going to give you all the essential steps to set up DHCP for this environment. DHCP requires a much more detailed description than what I'm going to show you over here. So if you're not familiar with DHCP, there are other videos in Trade Signal series that shows you completely how to configure DHCP server. Over here, I'm going to configure all the components that I need for the performance of RIS for this particular lab. So to begin with, here's a DHCP server. It is the DC1 server. I'm going to right click on it and then start a new scope by clicking on this link over here, new scope. I'm going to click on the next button, and over here for the name of the scope, I'm going to type BB-CA, namely Ben and Brady for California. Description is always optional, so I'm going to leave it blank. Click on the next button. Now for my IP address range, this is the IP address that the DHCP server will assign. What I'm going to do is pick up the entire range of our network, which is 200, 200, 201 to 200, 200, 200, 254. So I've picked up the entire range for this class C network of 200, 200, 200.0, and automatically it puts in the appropriate subnet mask for me, which is /24. So I'm set so far. Let's click on the next button, and now it wants to know what IP addresses to exclude. The IP addresses that you type in this particular range will be the excluded IP addresses, namely these IP addresses will not be assigned. In our case, we will select the first, for example, 15 IP addresses to exclude. So I'm going to click on the add button over here. In other words, what we have said so far is the following, that our range is 200, 200, 201 to 254, and what we would like to do is exclude the first 15 IP addresses so that the first IP address that is assigned to the client computer is going to be 200.200.200.16. A quick word on exclusion. Exclusions are done so that when you give static IP addresses to your servers, like we did in our case to DC1, which is 200.1, and DC2, which is 200.2, those IP addresses are not assigned by the DHCP server to the client. One of the important things that you have to understand about the DHCP server is that the DHCP server simply assigns IP addresses. it does not verify for the uniqueness of those IP addresses on your network. It is your responsibility to make sure that you have set up the appropriate scope so that the clients do get appropriate IP addresses. And that's what we are attempting to do over here. So I'm going to click on the next button, and then the lease duration is 8 days, which is the value by default. I'm going to leave it the way it is. And now it's asking me to configure all the other options. Let's see. At this point, the DHCP server knows to assign an IP address, to give a subnet mask, and give the lease duration of 8 days, which is plenty for our environment. We also have to tell the DHCP server that our DNS is domain controller 1. So what I'm going to say is that yes, I would like to configure additional options now, and click on the next button, and it's asking me for a router. In our environment, we have simply one network, so a router is not necessary. So I'm going to click on the next button, and then over here for the parent domain, I'm going to type benandbrady.com, and for the server name over here, I'm going to type, it's asking us who's going to be the DNS server. So our DNS server is going to be DC1, and the best method over here is to type the name of the computer and click on the resolve button. It should automatically pop in the IP address of that particular server, which is DC1. So automatically it filled in the IP address of 200.200.200.1. So that serves as a good verification that your DHCP server can find who the DNS server is. I'm going to click on the add button over here, continue, and now at this point I'm done. I'm not interested in Win service, and I would like to activate the scope now, which is yes, and then click on finish. Activating the scope basically means that it's going to assign IP addresses from that scope. Now I'm going to click on the refresh button over here, and click on the address pool, and verify that everything is the way it's supposed to. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this domain, benandbrady.com, and the computer object of that is DC1, right click on it, and then say authorize. Only after you authorize your DHCP server does it start assigning IP addresses. In order to authorize the DHCP server, you have to be either a domain admin or an enterprise admin to do so. So at this point, you're still seeing a red arrow pointing downwards. It should soon change to a green arrow pointing upwards. What I'm going to do is refresh my screen by pressing the F5 key, and it does take a few minutes to authorize. So I'm going to give it a few more minutes, and then you will see that there is a green arrow pointing upwards, and your DHCP server is now ready to assign IP addresses. It's taking just a little bit longer. The other thing that I've noticed helps is by closing the DHCP and then going into it one more time. And I've noticed a lot of times that when you start this program again, you will see that it has already authorized itself in the Active Directory. There we go. Green arrow pointing upwards. And here's our address pool, 1 to 254, 1 to 15 will be excluded. And here's our options. What we have said is that our domain name, which is also known as option 15, is benandbrady.com, and a DNS server, also known as option 6, is 200.200.200.1. So this was part of the requirement for the RIS server, and I've met one of the requirements, namely installing and configuring a DHCP server. Now we are ready to install and configure RIS. RIS, or Remote Installation Services, is a service. So just like with any other service, you need to go to Add Remove Programs, Windows Components, and then install it from there. But before I do that, a couple of things we need to do. To begin with, if you recall in the previous videos, I had mentioned that RIS requires that you have a separate partition from the system partition on which it will install itself. So let's go to our hard disk, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But let's first look at the physical structure of a hard disk. To do that, what you need to do is right click on your computer object and click on Manage. So this starts the computer management screen, and now click on the disk management link over here, and this will show you the physical structure of your hard disk. So in this case, my first partition on the hard disk is about 8 gigabytes, and I have so much free space. So what I'm going to do is, in this 30 gigabytes of free space, I'm going to create a new partition. So let's do that. I just right clicked on it and said create partition. This starts the creation of partition wizard, and I'm going to create a new primary partition. And this partition, I'm going to just create it about 4 gigabytes. That is more than enough for what I'm trying to do. So click on, I've typed 4000 megabyte, which is approximately 4 gigabytes. Click on the next button. It's going to assign the next drive letter, which is E. That is fine. Click on the next button. This is important. The file system must be NTFS, so I'm going to leave it as that. And then I'm going to say perform a quick format so that this operation goes faster. Click on the next button and then click finish. So once again, you need to have a separate NTFS partition, which is not the same as the system partition, namely the C drive itself. My partition is just created, so what I'm going to do is close this computer management screen and then go on, and let's verify the existence of this partition. So here we go. I'm going to double click on this one more time, and for some reason I cannot see the E drive. Maybe my screen is let's go back to DC1 and let's see what happened. Maybe it didn't finish and I thought it did. There we go. E drive is created and it says it is healthy. So let's check it out. You know, I don't think it did a good job creating this partition, because even though it says healthy, the properties don't look good. Okay, look at this, it's 0 bytes and so forth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this and do it all over again. So let's delete this partition. See if I can format it and get away with that. Perform a quick format. Okay, it's formatting it now. And as soon as the formatting finishes, it says healthy now. Let's check it out. I'm going to go to the DC1 over here. Still no E drive. Okay, let's see how we can troubleshoot this. Quite frankly, never happened to me before. Usually this process is pretty seamless. Once it creates a partition, it's there. Just want to verify whether I'm showing you the creation of this partition on the right drive, because I have several systems running over here and I think I'm okay over there too. So let's try it out one more time and let's see if I can access the E drive. Go to the command prompt. Nope, does not exist. Okay, just finished creating it. So what I'm going to do is close out of computer management and let's go to our my computer object, and here's the new drive, properties, and it is NTFS and it has enough space for me to perform RIS on this. So what we have done is the following. So far we have installed DHCP server and we've also created a separate partition on which RIS will be installed. Now RIS is a different service, so what we need to do is install a service and then of course we will configure it. So let's install the service known as RIS by going to settings, control panel, and once again we'll go to add remove programs, Windows components, and then from there we'll install the RIS service. So here we go. This is a separate service by itself, so I'm going to go down the list over here until we find it. Here we go, remote installation services. I'm going to select all the components of the service, click on next, and now again it's letting me know that I'm doing this in the remote administration mode. Once again, if you're not running terminal server, you will not see the screen. Click on the next button, it's going to start copying the files for us. Once the files are copied, then the server needs to be restarted, and then we need to do the following. And this should be absolutely clear to you, because this is where some of my students have made mistakes in the past. What you're doing is installing a client operating system. So I'm going to click on the finish button over here and let the server restart while I'm having this discussion with you. So we are installing a client operating system. One of the biggest limitations of RIS in Windows 2000 Server is that the only operating system that it supports is Windows 2000 Professional. So once again, in Server 2000, you can install the operating system Windows 2000 Professional only. In other words, if you would like to deploy clients such as Windows Millennium or Windows 98, RIS is not the appropriate service for you, because RIS supports Windows 2000 Professional computers only. Once again, make a note of this. In fact, you cannot even install Windows 2000 Server using the RIS service. Now, there is a tremendous improvement on this service in Server 2003. So if you're watching the corresponding CD in Server 2003 for the same lab 15, you will see that in that lab, in Server 2003 in RIS, you can install Windows 2000 Professional as well as Windows XP Professional as well as Windows Server 2003. But since we are doing this for the Windows 2000 portion, as far as we are concerned at this point, the only operating system that I can install is Windows 2000 Professional. Now, the way this installation will go is that once I've installed the remote installation service over here, I need to configure it. As part of the configuration, it's going to ask me for the CD-ROM for Windows 2000 Professional. So make sure you have the Windows 2000 Professional CD-ROM available, because it's going to take the files from the CD and then copy it to the partition that we just created on this RIS server. These are the files that are transferred from the RIS server to the PXE client by means of the TFTP service. So you need to have Windows 2000 Server CD available in the beginning, so that when you install DHCP server and RIS, the files are installed from the Windows 2000 server. Once that is done, you should remove the CD, and actually I'm going to do it right now. Just put the Windows 2000 Professional CD, because the next thing it's going to do is ask me to configure the server for RIS, and as part of the configuration of the server, it's going to copy the files from the Windows 2000 Professional CD to the server, and then these files will eventually get transferred over here and then get installed. So it works in that manner. Now, a couple of things to discuss over here while server DC1 is restarting. One of the things is that it required a separate partition in order to, so that when it copies the files, what it's going to do is copy the files from the Windows 2000 Professional CD to the hard disk, and it does not want these files to be mixed up with the current installation on that server, which is on a C drive. So it keeps it separate for that reason. And we also talked about the SIS service. This service also runs on a separate partition. The idea behind the service is to avoid duplication of files that are copied. Once we create a second image, you will see this in much more detail as to why this is required. So one of the things that you must do before you actually install RIS is that you must make sure that there is a separate partition, and that partition is configured, that partition is formatted as NTFS. Once the computer restarts and then you configure the service RIS, it will automatically pick up those partitions and then install the appropriate files over there for you, including make the image for Windows 2000 Professional. Now, those of you who've used a third-party imaging software like Ghost, and I'm going to show you this in a different video, you will notice that you don't actually have to install the client and make it ready in order to create the first image for RIS. RIS can create the image right off the CD-ROM for Windows 2000 Professional. After all it's doing is just copying the i386 folder from there and putting it on the server, and you will get to see all this in action. So what I'm going to do is minimize, and now let's make a connection to DC1, because DC1 has just restarted. So let's double click DC1, which is also now our RIS server. Okay, let's log in. Now, here's the exception to the rule. Usually you install the service from the control panel and then you configure it from Start, Programs, Admin Tools, and usually you'll find a link to that program waiting for you over here. For example, for DHCP, we did the same thing. We installed a service and then we went ahead and configured the service by clicking on DHCP. Also, as you install these services, they get out of alphabetical order. To put them back in the alphabetical order, you simply right click anywhere over here and say sort by name, so that here DHCP is listed under Ds now. You will notice that there is no such service called RIS installed for us. In fact, what has happened is that even though the service is installed, to configure it, you need to go back to the control panel. And again, this they have changed in Windows Server 2003 to make it much more intuitive. So I'm back over here, and when I go to Add Remove Windows Components, it tells me that there is a service called RIS sitting out there, and it's waiting for you to configure it. So the biggest exception over here is that in order to configure RIS, you need to go back to the control panel. This time when you click on the Add Remove Windows Components, it's asking you to please go ahead and configure the service. So let's click on Configure, and you will start with a wizard, and again the wizard will remind you of all the prerequisites and the requirements that you need before you can actually start configuring this. So let's go through this one more time. You need an active DHCP and DNS on your server. We have that. You must have a Windows 2000 Professional CD or a folder that contains the installation files. I've just put the CD in the computer, and on the client side of the computer, you need to have a PXE boot ROM or a network adapter that supports a boot floppy. In our case, I will show you how to create this floppy disk on the client side. So let's click on the next button, and now look at what it did. It automatically picked up the other partition, and it's going to create a folder called remote install. So I'm going to accept that and then go on next. This is where you will be stopped if you did not have or if you had not created a separate partition. So, and over here it tells you also the folder structure must be installed on a drive that is formatted with NTFS, and the drive cannot be the system drive. So it's got to be some drive other than the C drive. So click on next. And now it's asking us, do you want to respond to client computers requesting the service? This is a switch which you can turn on or turn off even later. In our case, yeah, we'll turn it on because after we do this, we actually want the server to respond to clients, namely a client who will get the operating system from the RISC server. So let's click on the next button. And now it wants to know the location or the path from which it will copy the Windows 2000 professional installation files. That's the word that's missing out here. So basically it needs to know the path of the CD-ROM. In our case, that is the D drive, so which is okay. We'll click on the next button, and now it's going to start copying the files from the CD-ROM to the hard disk. Before it does that, it's letting me know that it's going to create a folder called win2000.pro, which is fine. The reason it's creating a folder is because you can have several images, and this particular image will be created in this folder. So that way it neatly organizes all your images in different folders. And now it's letting us know that the friendly name for this particular image will be Microsoft Windows 2000 Professional, and here's the description. You will see more about how to configure this in a later video, but just to give you a little clue over here, once you have configured several images and then you go to the client computer, you're going to boot the computer with the client computer with the floppy disk. Once it connects to the RISC server, it will ask you, tell me which image do you want. So the line that whatever you put over here is exactly what's going to be displayed on that particular screen. In other words, this is the title of the image. Just like with the boot INI file that gives you the choice between different operating systems installed on your computer, this particular line is exactly what will show up on the image selection screen so that you can select the right image. In our case, Microsoft Windows 2000 Professional is appropriate, and this is additional information about this image. So I'm going to accept the default values, and now it's giving me the summary screen saying that it's going to copy the i386 folder from the CD-ROM. Okay, that's the Windows 2000 Professional CD. Create a folder called win2000.pro, that's the image folder. This will be in the E drive under the folder remote install, and we're going to take an extensive tour of this folder because you need to know how to navigate this folder and know exactly where the components are located. And then finally, click on the finish button, and it's going to start copying files. This process will take a good anywhere between 25 to 35 minutes because it does take a while to copy these files and configure the RISC component. So what I'm going to do is stop the video over here. As soon as this is finished, I'll join you one more time and to complete our RISC installation. Welcome back. The copying process just finished, and it took about 35 minutes on my computer to finish this process. So I'm going to click on the done button over here, and let's check out what actually happened. So I'm going to close this add remove programs box, and now let's go to my computer on DC1, and then over there we'll go to our drive, which is the E drive. Now this is what happened. As you know that it created a folder called remote install. In that folder it created several folders. There are a couple of folders that is of interest to us. Let's go to the first folder, which is the admin folder. Now if I were to double click on the admin folder, there is a folder called i386, and when I double click over there, there are two programs that we'll be using in these labs. The first of these programs is called the RBFG, also known as Remote Boot Floppy Generator. This is the program that will create the floppy disk for us that will be required on the client side to boot the computer with, and to be able to clone or replicate the PXE environment. So this is the one that will create the floppy disk for us that will simulate the PXE environment. Then the other one is a RipPrep. This program is used to create the image along with the applications, and will be the discussion of the next video. So once again, just to show you how to navigate this, in the remote install folder there is a folder called admin, and in there there's a folder called i386, and in there are two programs that is of interest to us. Okay, now let's go back. The other folder within the remote install folder besides the admin folder is the setup folder. I'm going to double click on that, and then there is a subfolder called English. In there is an images folder, and here's the first image that was created for us. If you recall, when we were configuring RISC, it told us that it will be creating a folder called win2000.pro, and here's a folder. In there is the i386 folder, and these are the files from the Windows 2000 Professional CD-ROM copied over that will actually be copied over to the client side. One other thing about this folder, I'm going to actually go back over here, and this whole folder called remote install, if I were to right click on it and go to properties, you will see that it is shared as REMINST. Okay, it is shared with a small name so that when the client connects to it, it will load a DOS driver, and so to make it compatible with the DOS file system, it made it 8 character or less share name. So once again, this folder is shared as REMINST. Okay, you can also view this by actually closing this, and then what I'm going to do is click on start, run, and then type /DC1. This should show me all the shares on this computer, and REMINST is the remote administration share or the remote install share, in which there's a folder called admin that we just saw, and then the other folder setup that we just saw as well. Okay, so I think I'm done with all the requirements on the server side. Let's verify that. We have Windows 2000 Server with RIS installed and configured. We have Active Directory, we have DNS, and we have successfully installed and configured a DHCP server. So as far as on the server side is concerned, I'm ready with my first image, which is Windows 2000 Professional. Now on the client side, what do I need? Well, either I have a PXE boot client, or I have a NIC card that supports the PXE environment by means of a floppy disk. In our case, I'm going to use the second method. Not that my client is not PXE, it is, but I would like to show you how to create a floppy disk and simulate this environment. So here's what I have done, and just to show you the configuration of my computer, what I'm going to do is the following. Take you back to DC1, and let's look at the NIC card of DC1. So I'm going to right click on My Network Places Properties. The reason I'm showing you this particular NIC card is so that I'm using exactly the same equipment on the client side, so you know exactly what kind of a network card am I using. I'm using a 3COM 3C918 integrated. This is also what is known as 3C905B compatible NIC card. Let me just move the screen a little bit here if I can. Here we go. So it is 3C905B TX compatible. There is a list of 25 NIC cards that works with RIS. This happens to be one of them. Okay, so we are all set. Once again, I'm using exactly the same equipment on the client side. I'm just showing you this NIC card over here so to tell you what actually is installed on my client side. It does not matter what network card you're using on a server. Remember, it's a client that should support that NIC card, not the server itself. On the server, you'll be running the RIS server itself. On the client side, you need to have a NIC card that supports the PXE boot environment. So now we need to format a floppy disk, and then actually create a boot disk for the for the remote installation process to work. So let's do that. I have already inserted a floppy disk. It is blank and formatted in my floppy drive. So here it is. Okay, you're looking at a blank screen of a floppy disk. So we are all set with that. Now let's go ahead and create a boot floppy with the RBFG program. Once again, the RBFG stands for Remote Boot Floppy Generator. And to get to that program, we will go to the E drive, remote install, admin folder, i386, and then here's the program that we will run. Now before I run this program, let me show you the list of NIC cards that are supported. I'm going to click on the adapter list, and here are the NIC cards that are supported. The one that we are using is 3C905B TX, which is of this type. Okay, but you will see that most of the NIC cards from 3COM. There's another popular one, 3C905CTX, that you may have used in the past. There are some from Compaq, there are some from HP, and then Intel. This is a very popular NIC card also, which is also supported. SMC has some. Unfortunately, the ones that are popular for small networks or for home networks, Linksys is not supported over here. So make sure you have a client computer that has one of these NIC cards listed. Now, one has one of these NIC cards installed in it. And also, here's the other myth. Some people think that you actually have to go over there and click on that particular NIC card and click on OK to create a disk for it. That's not true. This is just a generic adapter list. It's going to create a boot floppy that is compatible with any of these NIC cards. So once again, our requirements are met, and then I'll click on Create Disk, and it's going to create a disk for us. It's writing files to the disk. It's a very, do you want to create another disk? I'm going to say no. Click on Close. What I was about to say is that it just actually puts one file on that floppy disk. Let's verify that. On the floppy drive, there's only one file that is put called RIS disk, and this floppy disk along with this file will do the following. It's actually quite amazing. Here's what it's going to do. Going back to our diagram over here. Let me take you to this particular diagram now. So this is a diagram for benandbrady.com, and we are about to start the RIS process. Here's what this floppy disk will do. it will, number one, boot this computer. Okay, so it will actually start this computer. Once the computer starts, it will load the NIC card driver for the NIC card that is installed in this computer, and then try to contact the DHCP server and obtain an IP address. So it will send the DHCP discover packet to the DHCP server, and then it will finally obtain an IP address. Once the IP address is obtained, it will then contact RIS server and try to authenticate itself into the Active Directory environment. So it will contact RIS server. RIS server will say, well, welcome, but I need a username and a password before you can actually start getting images from me. This is where you'll enter the username, the password. Once that is verified in Active Directory, the RIS server will give you a listing of images, if there are a listing of images, or if there is just one image, like it is in our case at this point. It will simply say, here's Windows 2000 Professional. The files will be copied from DC1 to the Pixie client by means of the TFTP server, and then once the files are copied, this computer will restart, and then Windows 2000 Professional will be installed on it. So that's how this process works. This does take a little while, and those of you familiar with Ghost or any other imaging process, please note that this process does not finish in like 15 to 20 minutes like you would expect in a typical imaging environment, or even less in some cases. This is actually a transfer of files from DC1 to the Pixie client. So files will be transferred across the network cable. Once the files are installed over here, then the computer will come up, boot up, and then run what is known as a mini setup wizard, and then finish the installation of Windows 2000 Professional on this computer. So it's more like unattended installation, where the files are automatically copied from the server to the client. All you have to do is hook up the client to the server, RIS server, by means of the floppy disk, and then the process automates itself. If you have several clients over here, you can go from client to client using a floppy disk and boot up all these clients, and then the RIS server will send the files to each one of them independently as well as simultaneously. So that's how this process works. So we are done on the server side, and we've also made the floppy disk for the client side. Now it's time to actually boot the client with the floppy disk and get our client installed with Windows 2000 Professional. So here then is the procedure that you will perform on the client side. To do this, what I've done is prepared this document for you, and I've taken snapshots of these of the screen and then put pictures in my notes over here. So unfortunately, I cannot show you a live screen because it's a DOS program and my recording program cannot run simply because there's no operating system installed on it. So what I've done is the following. I have taken screenshots, and I'm going to go through the steps as I'm doing it right now with you. The only difference is that you cannot see my live screen. Instead, I'm telling you exactly what I'm doing. So to begin with, I'm going to take the floppy disk that we had created on the from the server and put it in the client computer. So I've taken the floppy disk from DC1 and I've now inserted it into the client computer. Now I'm going to start this computer. Once this computer starts, what's going to happen is the following. The floppy disk will now start this computer, and then as this computer starts, it's going to load the software or the driver for the NIC card. In our case, it is the 3COM 3C905B NIC card. So it loaded the NIC card driver, and it's loading it now on my screen as I'm watching it. And then after the NIC card driver is loaded, it will try to contact the DHCP server. So I don't know if this is clear to you on the screen or not. And I can show you from our DHCP server also that the client is actually connected to it. So as this activity is taking place in the background, I'll eventually show you everything there is to see on the server side. Unfortunately, on the client side, you'll have to depend on these pictures from me. So I just started the computer, I powered it on, the floppy disk restarted the computer, it loaded the driver for the NIC card, and then it contacted the DHCP server, and the DHCP server gave it an IP address. Let's observe that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to on DC1, so I'm on DC1 now. I will go to DHCP server and show you that this is actually happening in the background. On DHCP server, what we should expect to find is in the address leases that an IP address of 216 is assigned to us, and if you look at the clock over here, it is 5:03. It just got the IP address a couple of minutes ago. Okay, so the IP address has been assigned to us, and this process is taking place in the background. So I'm going to close the DHCP server. Just wanted to show you that this is actually happening in the background as I speak. And then once it obtained the IP address on the DHCP server, then what it does is the following. It tries to load or contact the RIS server, and in doing so, it will prompt you to press the F12 key. So as soon as it obtains the IP address on the DHCP server, let me show you the screen one more time. This actually is a better screen. So it just obtained the IP address of the DHCP server, and then it will start the TFTP service on the client and then try to contact the RIS server. Once it makes a connection, you have to press the F12 key within a few seconds. If you do not do so, this process will abort, and then you'll have to reboot your computer one more time. So once again, if I were you, I would keep a finger ready on the F12 key, so that when it prompts you, please press that key immediately, just like you do for F8 to go to the advanced options for Windows if you would like to go to the advanced options, that is. So once again, the procedure is as such: you start the computer with a floppy disk. It will obtain the IP address from the DHCP server. Immediately after it obtains the IP address from the DHCP server, you'll press the F12 key. This is when it makes a connection to the RIS server. And now what RIS server will do is it will use the TFTP protocol to transfer what is known as the CIW wizard, or the client installation wizard. This is a wizard like any other. What it did was the RIS server transferred the files required for the client installation wizard on the client. So now the client installation wizard program is on the client, and it is going to guide you with the steps necessary in order for you to complete the installation of Windows 2000 Professional. So here we go. This is the client installation wizard running on a DOS screen on the client side. And then over here, basically it's going to ask for the username and the password of somebody who's authorized to do so. So here we go. I entered the username administrator, I entered the password, and our domain is benandbrady.com. This is where the Active Directory comes in. Now this client will be authenticated by the Active Directory or by domain controller. It will be verified whether or not this person has the authority to actually get the image from the RIS server. Once this process is done, in other words, once I'm authenticated, just to show you the screen, it also shows you that you're connected to DC1. Okay, so I know which RIS server I'm connected to. It is possible to have more than one RIS servers. This tells you basically which server is providing you with the image. Once the authentication process is done and you hit enter, now it's going to give you a warning saying that, well, all the files on the hard disk will be deleted. Just a word of caution over here: you are not allowed to create partitions while using RIS. So make sure that the hard disk is blank, or if there are files on a hard disk, you do not need those files. If so, please back them up before you try this procedure. Okay, so you're not allowed to create a partition. In fact, that becomes one of the restrictions of RIS. In other words, if you had a 40 gigabyte hard disk, it will make one big 40 gigabyte partition, no choices. So once you accept saying that, well, you don't mind the hard drive being deleted, you press enter. Then it will give you a message screen. The message screen basically says that it's going to create a computer account for you called administrator1. Again, this is done by default, and I'll tell you exactly why it picked up the username administrator1, or rather the computer name administrator1. It will also assign it a globally unique ID, and here's the ID that is assigned to it. And now it's letting you know that the server, or rather the RIS server supporting this, is DC1. Okay, and then you press enter. It will start the installation process. At this point, you'll be seeing a file transfer process, just like you see the process at work when you're installing Windows 2000 Professional from a CD-ROM. In other words, the same screens repeat themselves, just like you're installing Windows 2000 Professional from a CD-ROM. The only difference is that this method is automated, and it is possible to start this process on multiple clients simultaneously, so that all these computers get Windows 2000 Professional at the same time. So Windows 2000 Professional will continue installing. Again, this process takes about 30 to 35 minutes. Once the computer restarts, it will go through a mini setup wizard and ask you basic questions such as what's the name of the company, what's your name, whether you would like to join a workgroup or a domain, just like the screens that you see at the time of installing from a CD-ROM itself. So that should conclude the process on the client side. Once this client is up and running, what I'll do is I will give you a tour of the client to show you exactly what was done out there, and then you will also learn as how to configure and control this process. Namely, if you notice over here, what it did was it automatically picked up a computer name called administrator1. This actually came from the username that was entered as part of the RIS process. In other words, when you authenticated to the RIS server, you entered the username of administrator. What the RIS server does by default is that it takes the username that is running this process and increments that name by the number 1. In other words, if you were installing Windows 2000 Professional simultaneously on 3 computers at this time, the first computer's account will be administrator 1, the second computer's account would be administrator 2, and the third computer's account would be administrator 3, so that it maintains the uniqueness of computer names as required by the laws of networking. 2 computers cannot have the same network name, computer name simultaneously. So just to make sure that it complies with that with that requirement, it keeps the computer's name separate in this manner. Of course, when the computer reboots, you can change that. Also, there's a way of actually setting up your own custom names over here rather than using the username of the person who's installing this, who's going through this process. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to give it some time, about 35 minutes, and then RIS will finish installing. At that point, I will make a remote connection to Windows 2000 Professional and show you exactly what was done. In the meantime, I'm going to pause this video and join you after the installation of Windows 2000 Professional is complete. Welcome back. The client just finished installing Windows 2000 Professional, and now let's check it out. So I'm going to minimize the screen, and what I've done is the following. Because we are trying to access Windows 2000 Professional, which does not include remote desktop, and there is no way I can access it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a third-party software known as Symantec PC Anywhere. So I'm going to use that software to actually connect to Windows 2000 Professional, and so that I can show you the screens on my screen. So what I've done is, after Windows 2000 Professional installed, I installed PC Anywhere on it and configured it as a host, and now I'm going to be the remote on my recording workstation so that I can access the screen. Once again, this is just an optional step. I have configured my computer as such so that I can bring all the screens to you and show you exactly what has taken place in our lab. So I'm going to select the client connection over here, and this will attempt to log me on to the workstation on Windows 2000 Professional. So here I'm going to log in as administrator, put in the password, and now I'm running a PC Anywhere session looking into Windows 2000 Professional. So let's check out the values. To begin with, let's right click on my computer, click on properties, and then under network identification, you can see right away it's Windows 2000, and under network identification, it is a computer whose name is administrator1 and belongs to the network benandbrady.com. So there we go. The client is successfully installed, and it took about 35 minutes. Now what I'm going to do is just reposition the screen a little bit so I can access the start button on Windows 2000 Professional. Here we go. And just to show you that this just consists of the operating system itself. No application has been installed. Okay, the only application that I'm running from here is Symantec's PC Anywhere, so that I can access the screen and show you what has happened on the client side. Now I'm going to minimize this screen, and now let's go back to DC1 and check out what happened on the server side. So what I'm going to do is click on the admin tools and then select Active Directory users and computers. Now remember, now we have a client in our benandbrady.com network, so we need to go to the computers container. Here we are, and here's the computer name, administrator1. Okay, so the administrator1 was installed as a client in the benandbrady.com network, and now you can imagine, if you want to deploy several clients in your network, all you have to do is run RIS on the server side, then on the client side go with the floppy disk, or if you have a PXE boot environment, that is sufficient. Once the computers come up and they connect to the RIS server, the process is pretty much automated. After that, it will install the operating system and then make themselves a client of the benandbrady.com network. Last but not the least, let's check out something else over here. What I'm going to do is minimize the screen and go back to the Windows 2000 Professional client screen, and then over there I will run the command prompt. And in the command prompt, I'm going to type ipconfig. Here we go, ipconfig, and put /all to see the complete TCP/IP configuration on the client side. Once again, it says the host name is administrator1. It belongs to the DNS or the DNS suffix, or the domain name is benandbrady.com. But check this out also. Who provided it the IP address? The DHCP server was provided by 200.1, which is also DC1, and DNS server is also DC1. So once again, our DHCP server continues to provide all the settings to us in the network. So at this point, we have a functional network. If you want to deploy clients, simply, as I said, go around to each computer with a floppy disk and then get the clients installed in that manner. And that should also conclude our video on remote installation services. Let's summarize what we have done in this particular video. In this particular video, to make sure that RIS actually works, we had to meet the prerequisites on the server side, which was to install Windows 2000 with the RIS service installed and configured. RIS was also configured and installed on a separate partition, which must be NTFS. You also require the presence of Active Directory in your network. In our case, we had benandbrady.com installed. You need a DNS server. We did not have a DHCP server, so we installed and configured a DHCP server. On the client side, the requirement is just one, which is either a PXE client Or if it is not a PXE client, it must have a NIC card that supports a PXE environment. So if that's the case, then you need to create a boot floppy using the Remote Boot Floppy Generator program, also known as RBFG. And then after that floppy disk was created, we simply took that floppy disk to our client and then started the computer with it, followed the prompts on the screen, and then eventually we successfully installed Windows 2000 Professional on the computer. I thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you very soon in a different video in the Active Directory series in Windows 2000.